We are back in Don't Ask Me About Color, a retrospective of Mehlli Gobhai, which opened here in March, but unfortunately had to be closed to the public thanks to the pandemic and the lockdown. When we came in here this morning, it was amazing to see how Mehlli's paintings glowed out again, and they're so luminous, and really I just fell in love with his early work all over again. And I can't help thinking that a retrospective like this is a very rare event. Even though we've curated it, I feel that it's an act of homage to one of our most sublime abstractionists. Mehlli Gobhai, who passed away 2 years ago, was really an extremely distinguished artist who focused very, very strongly on his art. And his art, which many people tended to over-identify with his later, more penumbral, darker works, actually went through many different phases, which we've borne witness to in this exhibition. And what surrounds us here as we speak is an early phase of his work where, to the shock of many contemporary viewers, he was actually a master of color. And Nancy, I know we've both felt through these months of the lockdown the sadness of paintings and sculptures and drawings that have sat in darkness without an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. We've often dreamt of, what's happening to Mehlli's works here. Mehlli's art is an art of shadows, penumbras, half-glimpsed light. And unfortunately, because of the lockdown, Mehlli's art was completely devoid of any illumination. And I remember how lovingly I lit up various paintings. And I remember as we were lighting the paintings, through the layers of darkness, you'd actually see an undertone of yellow or pink or blue. And now, it's extremely sad that this retrospective, has to be closed down. It hasn't had a good enough run, and this is the first level. This is where we started, and of course, at the beginning we had some issues about what should go where. But I think we finally managed to reconcile our different approaches and different ways of looking, and. In a way, it was going back to sitting around the dining table with Mehlli and discussing his art, but also talking about life. And Mehlli's art and his artistic practice and his life were always intertwined. Even as his cousin Noshir Gobhai, who's documenting the show, was talking about his love for animals, for nature. There weren't two different people. Mehlli, the artist, who was speaking from Olympus, versus Mehlli, the friend. These two aspects of his personality were very much, they were confluential. And you can see his empathy, even though some people think that his abstraction is very cold. Not, of course, at this level, this early work, but the work that we know, that we recognize his signature from. But actually, his abstraction is not cold. In fact, or it's not just hardened geometry. It's full of empathy, and we shall discuss this as we unfold the show. And here we have works from the early 70s, and we decided that we would put this particular work right at the center. It's almost like an iconic work. It's, as you can see, there's a faint resemblance of Krishna playing the flute in this work, and we thought that this would be the perfect axis to begin the show with. And when you look at this work, you have, again, we were talking about the palette, so it's Krishna blue, and of course the sap green, this lacquer red that you find in the work. On the one hand, it's of course familiar iconic imagery for the Indic mind, but on the other hand, you also know that he was familiar with Willem de Kooning. And Willem de Kooning, again, was an abstractionist, but he was very much committed to the figure and to deconstructing the figure.
Also, what we've tried to do through this exhibition is to bring to a contemporary audience the life of the mind that Mehlli led. Mehlli was immersed in a world of ideas. In his library, for instance, there are copies of art journals and books from decades ago, each one marked in the margins with his notes, with his constant arguments and discussions with artists and thinkers from previous generations. Also, this work, which is an abstract departure from the Krishna form, comes from his, as you know, his own reading and engagement with the work of George Keat. George Keat was a Sri Lankan artist who lived in Bombay for a certain period, and he translated and illustrated the Gita Govinda, Jayadev's classic. And that was also for a long time a key concern with Mehlli, looking, for instance, at how you move from figures and objects to more abstract departures. In the ski wall, for instance, there are many works here which begin with the idea of the still life, a container, objects, fruits, all kinds of things that spill out. So on this floor, what we've also tried to do is to think about this great overflow, the spilling out of color, of thought, of emotions, which later in Mehlli's work becomes far more restrained and more refined. But this is a moment of festivity. It's also done... many of these works come from the 1970s, and they come from a period in Mehlli's life when, maybe you want to pick up this story, Nancy. Mehlli in New York, what did that mean? Meeting artists like Knox Martin, who was a mentor. And of course, he would always, throughout his life, quote Knox Martin's dictum, which was, "The bartender should never be tipsy."
Yeah, I mean, this is one of his favorite, sayings, and we would often laugh together whenever he repeated this. And by this, of course, he meant that an artist should not be seduced by color or by form or by any kind of, figural manifestation. He always believed in restraint. And that is why we called this exhibition, "Don't Ask Me About Color. Mujhse rang ki baat na karo." And of course, we don't know how Mehlli would have responded to this title, because he would
Mehlli
have preferred,
hated all titles.
He would have preferred to have, to have just called his show Untitled. But I think that Mehlli, on the one hand, of course, he could be quite dogmatic about certain things, but on the other hand, he also believed in a dialogic conversation. And I think that he might have come around to this title as well. And just as you were talking about Knox Martin again, the idea was that Mehlli did not reject color, as we can see. There's evidence of this on the first level. Mehlli did not want an artist to be seduced by color. If he saw a lot of color, whether it was a garden or it was a painting, he'd just say, "I have a headache. That's too much color," he'd say. And his practice was, if one can use that problematic word, his practice was a spiritual practice, because he was constantly paring down color, paring down figuration, and reaching for the light, for the Newman. And of course, we wanted to have a provocative title because people who are familiar with Mehlli's works expect the palette to be brown and umber and sepia, and they would actually walk into an exhibition where darkness was not the dominant note. They would actually walk into a space of festive color. And we wanted that kind of provocation, that kind of slight tension or resistance, with which the audience would relate to the exhibition. And again, these are works which were packed away in his flat in New York, which was on Lexington Avenue, and they remained there for decades together. And they were brought back to Bombay a few years before he passed away. So what you're actually seeing here on this wall are works that nobody's seen before. And again, as Ranjit was saying, we have still lives and we have his iconic figures. The still lives, again, what I found extremely fascinating, this work, for instance, you can see the psychic contents of the mind pouring out. And so on the one hand, you have the still life, which is like a river of disturbance and disquiet, and then you have the deconstruction of Krishna here. And here you again have maybe a faint semblance to Nandi. And what was really fascinating was that while we were doing research for this show, we were also looking at his notebooks. And we were familiar with some of his notebooks, but once we started preparing for the exhibition, we started doing deep research. And that's when we realized how, for instance, you actually, I mean, not only is there evidence of the iconography of Krishna or Nandi or Ganesh, for instance, which we have on this level, but that you actually see in his notebooks how that iconography of Krishna or Nandi then slowly transforms into a rectilinear geometry. And that's how we transition from the first level of the exhibition to the second one. You actually transition from the iconic figure, maybe just a limb or an elbow, and then that turns into a straight axial line or an oblique or a diagonal. And we wanted the viewer to subliminally feel and experience this transition, which he, in a way, which we also see in his notebooks. He's documented this transition.
And just a note on color, it also helps us to think about the visual culture in which Mehlli was immersed. We know that in the 1970s he was looking at the work of Willem de Kooning, he was looking at the work of Philip Guston, but he was also looking at Rajput and Pahadi miniatures with a great deal of attention. And also in conversations over the years with us, he always expressed his joy, particularly in the schools of Bundi and Kota, which are lively, full of animal life and vigor. But he also responded strongly to the Pahadi schools. So what we're seeing here is also a great apprenticeship to different artistic traditions, different schools, different lineages. And a label like abstraction doesn't really do justice to all of this kind of artistic education that went into the making of the man and his very particular practice. Do you want to move up?
When we look at this painting, which hasn't weathered very well, unfortunately, what you actually see is the stratigraphy of color. So you see all the different underlayers. And for instance, you have blue, which is actually peeking out of yellow. And of course, this particular red, because we were talking about miniature paintings, so Pahari and Rajput miniature paintings. And this would be a good example of that. And also, at some level, there's also a conversation which is happening with Philip Guston.
Indeed.
Especially in the way in which some of these forms, these circular forms swirl on the canvas, and not only at a formal level, but also in terms of the disturbance. Because when you see Guston's work again, you have some of this candy red tones, but then again, there could be a narrative of fascism which is being, discussed or commented upon. So again, in Mehlli's work, it's not just some form of lyrical abstraction. It's not lyrical. You can see, I was talking about the psychic contents of the mind spilling out. You can see the disturbance and the disquiet as well.
It's also profoundly and robustly physical and visceral abstraction. And you're right to talk about how Mehlli was engaged throughout his life really with Guston's late work. As you said, Guston, both in the early and the later phases, was deeply engaged with the disturbances of American public life, the Ku Klux Klan and racism. These figures are present in his early work, they're present in the late work as well. And Mehlli, despite seeming apolitical, was also deeply concerned with political problems, with social asymmetries, with the vulnerability of large sections of people. So all of this is playing in the background to these seemingly sublime and otherworldly works. What I love about this phase in Mehlli's work and our presentation of it here and what it's allowed us to do is exactly what you said, the stratigraphy, which also took us into an exploration of Mehlli's methods, his working methods. The way in which, for instance, in many of these paintings on this level, he uses oil, he uses acrylic, sometimes very experimental combinations of gouache and acrylic, or gouache and ink in some cases, casein, graphite, here and there a stroke that's made with a marker. And it's this radical experimentalism that I think informs even the later, more stately and seemingly more dignified work. At every point, Mehlli was a maker, someone who was actively engaged with his materials. And elsewhere in the exhibition, we talk about how, for instance, in his notebooks, there are things that he's learned from printmakers, there are things he's learned from seeing how people make woodcuts, recipes for beeswax.
Yeah, that
was
something which was really fascinating, because both Ranjit and I, when we were individually going through the notebooks, we just found these recipes, for making, rabbit glue, or a recipe for beeswax. And in that particular recipe for beeswax, at the end of it, there's an annotation used by Kandinsky. So again, there's a kind of historical conversation that is going on, especially the history of materials, of making. And there was also, there were also preparatory notes for a workshop that he was going to attend. This was in New York, I think perhaps it was when he was at the Art Students League. And it was a wood sculpture workshop which was being conducted by John Rood. And there in his notes, you see all the tools that he would need for experimenting and workshopping. And again, when you look at those tools, Ranjit and I were discussing, it was almost alchemical. On this first level, we decided that we would include a work which belongs to Mehlli's personal collection. So here we have the Chamunda Devi, and it's the Devi in her Ugra, very fierce avatar, and she's holding a skull cup and a mace. What is really fascinating about this Chamunda sculpture is that she has her finger on her lips. So here we have the Devi with the Rahasya Mudra. So it spells secrecy. And in a way, it seemed like the perfect note to start the exhibition with. Abstraction is about mysteries of different kinds, cosmic mysteries, private ones. And on the one hand, the Rahasya Mudra signals the impossibility of deciphering the language of abstraction. On the other hand, the Rahasya Mudra also is a way for us, for signaling Mehlli's vulnerabilities. The fact that there were some things that Mehlli could not talk about. Mehlli was always open, very dialogic. He loved to talk to people from different, from different sections of society. He could actually, meet and talk to a person who sold fire extinguishers, for instance, and also, a viewer who just walked into an exhibition. He also spoke to animals. He loved animals and birds. But there was also another side to Mehlli. While Mehlli did not hide his sexuality, he also did not want to, he did not wish to draw attention to it. And we wanted to respect that. So on the one hand, there are many markers in this exhibition which talk about his subjectivity, his sexuality, and also about how he was queering his works. And but we do this in a tangential manner, because this is the way also Mehlli would have liked to perhaps talk about something which was very important to him, but also something that he did not feel that he could articulate in public. Of course, amongst his friends, we all knew that he was gay, and that was not a problem for him. But he never believed in identitarian politics, and he hated being sort of classified as somebody who belonged to a particular ethnicity or nationality, or somebody who had a particular sexual preference. So this is the way in which, I think this is something that we really enjoy at a curatorial level. How do you actually speak about the unsayable? And how something can be interpreted at various levels. So we take something which is part of his personal collection and use that as a conversation starter.
And it's a pivot. The Chamunda is a pivot for the whole exhibition. It's a focal point here, but it's also a figure, the guardian of mysteries, that you return to after you've seen the whole exhibition. And when you meet Chamunda again, as you leave the exhibition, you see her not only as the guardian of mysteries, but as also someone who has enlightened you, who is both a custodian and a teacher, if you will. We're now on the second level of Don't Ask Me About Color, Mehlli Gobhai, a retrospective. And the paintings that we see here are the first paintings of Mehlli's that were ever presented to the public. And already we see how in the space of very few years, in the late 1970s, Mehlli moved from a celebration of color, from polychrome works, to a much more austere palette, a much sharper and more geometricized way of approaching his paintings. The works that surround us here were shown in two major museum exhibitions, Marking Black at the Bronx Art Museum in 1980, and Hard Line Drawing as Primary Medium at the Islip Art Museum in 1984. These exhibitions, in some sense, established Mehlli in his own circle of artists and lovers of art in New York. And I think it's instructive and salutary for us to remember that in these exhibitions, he was showing alongside abstractionists like Sean Scully, Ad Reinhardt, and these are legendary names. So when we see Mehlli as an Indian artist, we also need to see him in his larger, more international context, and to remember that he was always part of that context. So we have to develop a kind of bifocal vision when we think about Mehlli and his work. We see him within a certain national art history, but we also see him as a participant in a global history of abstraction or abstractions.
And when you look at these works, for instance, we have transitioned from chromatic brilliance on the first level to a very spare language on the second level. And although in these works he's reaching for the numinous, he hasn't relinquished his claim on the human subject. And I think that's very important, because even here you can actually see, just the faint semblance of a pelvis or a knee or an elbow. And on the one hand, you could actually see these works as a form of classical experimentation in the history of abstraction. But on the other hand, when you look at his own personal trajectory of how his language was evolving, you can see how he's dealing with the human figure. The human figure is the figure is being buried under layers of color. The palette has gone from lacquer red and sunflower yellow to brown, black, umber, relieved by plum or burgundy.
What also fascinates me about this phase of Mehlli's work is the process. As we said earlier, he was committed to the materiality, the hands-on reality of making things. So when we're looking at works like these, we're also thinking about the preparatory processes, which involved using cutouts, using collage. In fact, one of the works that we have here is a collage, where you see how he's working with a vocabulary of sharp shards of paper, fragments of paint. He's using a plumb line. He's acting almost as a surveyor, working with the field of the painting. And it's really this dance of the line, of the angle, of the tangent that we see celebrated here. And I think it's at this time that Mehlli really feels that he needs to move to this non-figurative, non-objective kind of painting. But as you just said, Nancy, the figure and the object do not really abandon him, nor does he abandon them. I also find deeply fascinating and satisfying about this phase the way in which Mehlli uses aluminium powder, not necessarily in these works, but in works from this period that we have in the Dome. He's using graphite powder, he's using Conte, he's using dry pastels, aluminium powder. Again, like an alchemist, bringing these different materials together and transforming them into something perennial, something that's mysterious, enigmatic, and holds our attention to this day and into the future.
A word also on the curatorial strategy. Ranjit, you were just mentioning the works from the 80s, which were made with aluminium powder and Conte, and those works are actually there in the Dome. So one of the things that we decided when we were preparing for the show was that we were not necessarily interested in chronology, but we were interested in temporality. And I think that distinction is very important because on the one hand, of course, you see the evolution of Mehlli's practice, but on the other hand, what you're also seeing are constant, there's a constant oscillation with figures and forms that he's plumbing and that he's, so as I was saying, we were not interested in chronology, but in temporality. And in this exhibition, you will see works from in this exhibition, you will see works from his early phase alongside an object from his personal collection. So on the first level, we have his paintings from New York, and then we have the Chamunda sculpture from his personal collection. Or we could have his advertising works, and they could be shown next to works, his paintings from the 90s or the 2000s. So what we were really interested in was also the dialogue that Mehlli was having between various aspects of his practice. he could be painting. He could also be, making illustrations for an advertising campaign. So it isn't as if he worked in compartments. He was always working in a fluid manner. He could draw very well, as we will witness in this exhibition. So he wasn't one of those abstractionists who couldn't draw. His figuration was absolutely enigmatic and also made with perfect. I'm losing it. Yeah, I think we can go there and then talk about it.
There are many ways of designing a retrospective. What was important to both of us, to Nancy and to me, was to present this retrospective in a way that invited viewers into the multifarious imagination of Mehlli Gobhai. So as Nancy just said, we were preoccupied with the temporalities with which Mehlli worked, the way in which he shuttled between his work in advertising, his work as a painter, the posters he made, for instance, for Sehmat, and his larger life of immersion in the lives of his friends, the life of the larger culture. So if we've divided up different phases in different parts of this building, it's also because we don't want viewers to have a very simple phase-by-phase understanding of how Mehlli's mind worked. Mehlli's mind was complex, his imagination worked in mysterious ways, and we want our viewers to go on that journey with Mehlli.
So we have Mehlli, who's very voluble, a great conversationist, and then you have Mehlli, who's an ascetic. sorry. On this level, we celebrate Mehlli's graphic gesture. We begin with works from his teenage years. They're actually dated April 1947. So we have works from the 1940s to the 2000s. And we have works here we've included works, we have drawings, we have his advertising work, we also have his children's book illustrations. And what you see here are the drawings that he made when the family visited Kodaikanal. And these are absolutely delicate, beautiful drawings of cats and horses, and also his mother, Parent Gobhai. And you also have Mehlli rowing a boat. So there's a self-portrait. And on the one hand, you have this freestyle sketching, but on the other hand, also, you can see references to ukiyo-e prints. And so you already see a budding artist here. And what's also interesting is that you have some works where you have the figures growing from the foreground to the middle ground to the background. So you already see his artistic imagination developing. It's not merely somebody who's making a doodle. It's somebody who is also exercising his spatial imagination.
And because this floor is dedicated largely to the graphic gesture in Mehlli's work, this was also the point where we bring into play the various histories of Bombay's cultural life of which Mehlli was a part. He studied drawing formally with the artist Shavaks Chavda, whose wife Khurshid Wazifdar was a dancer. So through the Chavdas and their circle, Mehlli also was exposed to the world of Indian classical dance and the world of Hindustani classical music. And these were interests that he carried with him throughout his life. So he would accompany Chavda to concerts where, and this was one of Chavda's specialities, master and pupil would both make quick, spontaneous studies of the musicians or of the dancers. And that's a skill that Mehlli prized greatly. So we also have, across the sequence of works here, we dwell on Mehlli's ability to bear witness to the body, his life studies, the works, the drawings that were rendered with sitters, with models. So that's a completely different aspect of Mehlli's work, relatively unknown to those who know him as an abstractionist.
Again, here in this particular cluster, you find Gigi, the model, and Mehlli used to go visit the Artists' Aid Center, as it was called, or the Artist Center, which was started by Ara. And so you have Gigi here, and then you also have his sketches from his days in New York. We also have a self-portrait, which is quite rare. Although he has, we have come across some self-portraits of his as sketches, but this particular kind of tangential self-portrait is very interesting. You just have these serialized heads, and it's basically somebody shaving. And what you actually see here is this interplay between masking and revelation. And again, just like we've actually have the Chamunda sculpture on the first level, we have this particular work, which again talks about both personal mystery as well as the mysteries related to art and the possibilities of deciphering it. So again, here in this particular work, we've actually flagged that alongside the Hijra heads, because it was a way of subliminally, gesturing to the viewer that Mehlli, although he did not talk about his sexuality, he did believe in the non-binary figure. So you have the Hijra heads, where the Hijra figure as a third being, somebody who's neither male nor female. And again, as you can see, these are very robust sketches that you find here. The face is actually covered with a warren of lines. Alongside the Hijra heads, we also have another display of his very strong graphic gesture. We have two posters, and the poster on the right is a poster that he made for Sehmat in the early 90s. And what I found in in one of his notebooks was preparatory drawings for this Sehmat poster. So here what we see is robust figuration and a very graphic image of a riot and two figures embracing each other in empathy. But in those preparatory sketches, what I found was two figures who were completely woven together with just lines, which felt like whiplashes on these figures, and through these interweavings of line and figures, what actually recedes is flesh and limb, and what emerges is pain and love.
And this is a deep dive into Mehlli's work in advertising. He worked with J. Walter Thompson, a transnational advertising agency. And this is artwork for ads that were made for Air India and which appeared in Time magazine. And viewers who look closely will see that these were all made in the late 1950s. So this is extremely rare material indeed, where you see Mehlli as an artist working together with a gifted copywriter and developing these ads which are highly literary, highly artistic.
Also highly cosmopolitan.
And highly cosmopolitan, yeah. And really remind us of a time when our national carrier, Air India, was very much on the leading edge, not only of aviation, but also of culture. Mehlli Gobhai was always experimenting with the two-dimensional surface that was his domain as a painter. So what we've tried to do at this level of the retrospective is to focus on how he would enrich, open out, and amplify the possibilities of the two-dimensional surface. So on the one hand, for instance, he would take his cue from the great tradition of printmaking. What we have here are lino cuts and dry points that he made in the 1960s and 1970s. He apprenticed himself to the techniques of printmaking, to layering, to incision, and we see how these techniques were imported into his paintings. And what we also do on this floor is to take viewers through the process by which Mehlli's paintings also eventually became sculptural. They became objects. So what we're seeing here is a painter who's shuttling between printmaking and sculpture and expanding his own possibilities in the process.
On this level, we have provided an expanded portrait of Mehlli's practice. We have just looked at we have looked at examples of printmaking, of advertising illustrations, and now here we have a vitrine with his books. These are children's books which he illustrated, and some which he both wrote for and illustrated as well. And what's fascinating about these children's books is that some of them were based on Indian folk tales or mythology. The Blue Jackal, for instance, was a Panchatantra story. And we also have some books which are based on scientific thinking and experimentation. So you have books on electricity, on motion. There's also gallimaufry, which is basically a miscellany of mismatched images. So you have a mix-up of gender, of types. And Mehlli had a great sense of humor, and that's what you find in this gallimaufry book. Also, his love for children and animals, that's what you actually see in these books. His illustrations of children and animals are again very, very, very tender. And you can see his empathy for also for interspecies communication. One of the books that we've highlighted in this show is Lakshmi, the water buffalo, who wouldn't. And this is a delightful drag narrative where you have a man who disguises himself as a woman. And also what we've tried to show through the display of these children's books is that you are again not just looking at his children's illustrations in a silo. What you're looking at are his children's illustrations alongside his paintings, because what you find in these children's books is that he's using techniques such as layering, building up of the image. He's creating animated sequences, and in the show we've also shown the artworks, the original artworks for motion. So you actually see all the various positives and the images appearing like a palimpsest through them. And what else can I say? These books were written and illustrated between 1965 and 1975, and they were published by Prentice Hall, Hawthorne, and Holiday House, and he won many awards for these books. On this level, we are dealing with Mehlli's dilemma of how to go beyond the two-dimensional surface. During the 1990s, he started experimenting with the surface of the canvas, and he would layer the canvas such that it started looking like a low-relief sculpture, or it would resemble an architectural contour. And he would, staple handmade sheets, thick handmade sheets, either of kalam kush paper or kagzi paper, and he'd staple these sheets together. And then on these sheets of paper, you would see all his markings. on these sheets of paper, you would actually find the residues of all his actions, of gouging, of silting, bleaching, staining the work.
It's almost as if what Mehlli was doing was to enact the processes of time and of geology. So very often in these works, it's as if we are going down into a pit or looking at the side of a cliff. How does rock get formed? How is rock sedimented? What is the nature of chalk or shale? There's really a deep engagement here on Mehlli's part with the ways in which the earth has created itself. So it's a very unique moment when an artist replicates, given his own medium, the processes of the earth, of geology, of time. And on this floor, there's a very strong personal memoir, if you will, for me, which has to do with these cubes on the floor. And these come from the very first exhibition that I curated in 1993, which was an exhibition called Hinged by Light, and it had three abstractionists, Mehlli Gobhai, Prabhakar Kolte, and Yogesh Raval. And each of them pushed themselves beyond their comfort zone as painters. And that's when Mehlli really began to work with these blocks of wood. As you see, incising them, marking them, staining them, and moving to a point where, as you were saying, painting became more sculptural for him. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about...
And in the from the early 2000s, he started experimenting with what he called the constructed canvas, where he would actually be putting together... sorry.
I'll just move out.
Yeah. In the early 2000s, he experimented with what he called the constructed canvas. So what you see are many different canvases of different sizes being seamlessly put together. And yet, although they seem to be seamlessly assembled together, they are actually trying to defy gravity. In a way, they are protruding out. Although on the one hand, you feel the sense of perfectly incised lines, of a hardened geometry, and on the other hand, you find something hanging loose and low. And another thing perhaps that I'd also like to add is that along with what Ranjit, you were talking about, sedimentation of time and memory, in his canvases, there are also archetypal resonances. So what you actually see here are often, memories of ascension, or archetypal symbols of the cross, of the axis mundi. And what's really interesting about this space is that the NGMA Bombay is built like a cosmic spiral. And I think that the architecture of this space, in a way, complements Mehlli's work, which is also about the axis mundi, ascension. And because in this gallery, in fact, in all the galleries, from any given vantage point, you can see works in relation to each other. They become conversation pieces. There's a dialogical connection between them. And of course, then when we move to the dome, it's almost as if you climb into the sky of the exhibition. And both Ranjit and I have curated a number of retrospectives in this space, and therefore it's very special to us. In a way, it is like our curatorial workshop, I would say, this space.
It really is. And when you climb up into what you call the sky of the exhibition, there's really a tremendous sense of having made a certain journey. And that's really, for us, crucial, I think. For us, a retrospective is like a journey. It's like a pilgrimage. It's going into the unknown and the known territories of the artist's imagination. This series of works marks a breakthrough in Mehlli's practice. These are works that he made at the beginning of the 1980s. And as you see, he blurs the line between drawing and painting in these works. So what he uses here is a mixture of graphite, aluminum powder, crushed pastel, and conte. And when we look at these works, we think we're looking at the night sky. They're like time-lapse photographs of an eclipse, of constellations, and we don't know whether we're looking at the work of an artist or the work of an astronomer. And I find these particularly compelling because they really take us deep into a time when Mehlli was committing himself very fully to something that was beyond the retina, beyond optics. And to me, the importance of these works is that they lay the foundation for everything that followed. What we call the incision or venation, the imageless image of the tree that rises, the universal tree. All of these are coming to birth, literally, in these works.
Apart from the artifacts from his personal collection, like this guardian figure, we also have works by younger artists that Mehlli had collected. For instance, you have this work by Manish Nai, a jute work. You have a biomorph by Monali Meher. You have windows opening upon windows and the use of techniques of repetition and seriality by Sheetal Gatani. And you have this exquisite work by Madhav Imarte, which is made by layering of inland letters. Mehlli shared a beautiful friendship and Mehlli shared a beautiful relationship with younger artists. He was often in conversation with them. He even sometimes took their advice. He also wrote beautifully on the works of younger artists. For instance, he has written an essay on Madhav Imarte's work. And he also engaged in the writing of memoirs of his practice. For instance, he wrote an essay on abstraction. He wrote beautifully on Madhav Imarte's works. And the precision that he brought to the making of his drawings or paintings, the same precision he applied even to his writing. For him, every word mattered, just as every stroke mattered. And he wrote with great feeling, humor, and also with a certain amount of skepticism, which was Mehlli's personality. He was delightfully cantankerous and always doubting himself. we've now reached the dome, the sky of the exhibition, as it were. But we're speaking to you from a cave. We have created 2 caves on this dome level, and both these caves include objects from Mehlli's personal collection. And we also wanted to reflect on Mehlli's personal culture. So we've got his artifacts, which include this Rajasthani Haveli lock, which is almost shaped like a javelin, the Mukhi Dibba from Bengal. We have Balkrishna. We have fertility rings from Bastar. We also have his precision instruments with which he made his works. The plumb line that you were talking about, Ranjit, the scales. We have the Brahmand, the measuring jar. We have the Devi riding the tiger. We have these exquisite Kota drawings, hunting scenes. We have a Chola sculpture. Mehlli had great respect for the well-made artifact. He also had great respect for practitioners of subaltern art. He was never an insecure modernist.
That's actually very true. Although his own practice was that of an abstractionist, he had an immense generosity of spirit towards people who practiced, as we pointed out, these traditional arts, and especially the arts of the everyday. So although his own paintings inhabited a relatively rarefied realm, if you will, he had great respect for people who made these robust yet beautiful objects that once used to be part of the everyday texture of experience for people. And I'm also fascinated by his choice of Rajput painting and drawing. He reached out for Bundi and Kota because those schools emphasize violence, the hunt, the struggle between animals and human beings. So I find that extremely intriguing, that although his own art tended to reach for the sublime, the serene, the enigmatic,
but it also had a lot of violence. In fact, visible traces of violence. He even called his act of art making the brutalizing of the canvas.
Absolutely.
But I think that you've brought out a very interesting point. The fact that he collected hunting scenes, collected scenes which actually spoke of the tension between the human being and the animal world. And in fact, we also have a lovely clip from actually footage that Mehlli had shot in the 1950s. And when you look at that film footage, he had actually shot all over India, especially in the north. And also in the northern and eastern part of India. And when you look at it, some parts of it are auto-orientalist, in their gaze. Some of it reminds you of the Family of Man exhibition, Life magazine photographs. But there are also some very intimate scenes in it, which are not scenes which are taken from afar, where like an insider-outsider is looking at India, and that particular scene that we're talking about is the scene which actually has the Kota princess Sarsu, who's playing with a leopard cub, and we decided to show that particular clip in this cave. Because when we first met Mehlli, he had told us about the story, and then on every ride to Golwad, he would talk about Sarsu and the leopard cub, and he talked about how Sarsu was so beautiful. And then finally one day, the film footage was rescued by Jerry Pinto, the poet and critic, and we actually came face to face with Sarsu.
With Sarsu and her leopard cub.
Absolutely, and that was such fun. To encounter this footage and to actually see that his story was not fictional,
But I think Mehlli belonged to a generation of people whose experiences were larger than life, and which transcended cultural borders and boundaries. It's interesting that in his phalanx of friends, you have Charles Correa, the visionary architect and urban designer. You also have Jacinta Cunha, and Sylvester da Cunha, people who were active in advertising, but also in theater. And Remember also that early in his life, Mehlli went into theatre. He studied theatre with Ibrahim Al-Qazi, the polymath and pioneering theatre person in India. And Al-Qazi's circle was one that emphasized not only theatre, but also the visual arts, music, dance, and culture at large. So this is the kind of ethos that shaped Mehlli's sensibility. And it's a cosmopolitan Bombay that we look back to with a sense of nostalgia and loss. And it reminds us of a different cultural ideal that inspired our city.
And we've also got brochures for Al-Qazi's plays, which Mehlli had illustrated. Mehlli also acted in some of Al-Qazi's plays, and he was very impressed by Al-Qazi's rigor and his discipline. And I think as a young man, it was very important that Mehlli encountered stellar figures like Al-Qazi, who Al-Qazi himself had actually studied theatre in London and had come back. So what we also what we also see in this exhibition are glimpses of cosmopolitan. So what we also witness in this exhibition are glimpses of cosmopolitan Bombay, ranging across disciplines: theatre, design, advertising, film, and so forth.
Architecture.
And architecture.
Mehlli had a close and intimate and intense relationship with nature. He loved animals and birds, and he spent a lot of time in the midst of nature, whether that was in Andretta, in the hills, or in Golwad, where he had a chiku orchard. And he responded very, very strongly to flora and fauna, to butterflies, to birds. And in many of these works here, for instance, you find the presence of the tree. Now, this might just seem like a geometrical image or some kind of symbol, but it is the world tree. It's as if the sap were rising to the top. But processes of life and of mortality were twinned for Mehlli. So there's a very funny story he used to tell us about this image of the white streak. He found himself in a village one day where a vulture had just deposited its droppings. And as Mehlli told us the story, there was a white streak on a grey rock. And Mehlli looked at this vulture dropping and said to himself, "My God, is that how I'm going to end up?" So he had a sense of humor that could be grim sometimes. But when you look at a work like this, you find both that sense of mortality, the remembered vulture droppings, but also the opposite movement, that of the sap rising up the tree. And this is true of a number of the works that we find here. And now we are going to read an extract from Mehlli's Andretta journal, the diary that he kept when he lived in the Shivaliks, the foothills of the Himalayas. Strange walk.
Also on the same climb.
Came to a thicket.
Misty, cool.
With the giant devdars faintly visible around me.
There were lots of birds suddenly gathered there.
I could hear them without seeing them.
I stood very still.
For many minutes.
And suddenly, a group of small lemon-colored birds
flew out of the mist around me.
And for a brief, fragile moment, alighted
on my head and shoulders.
Before they realized
I was not an inanimate object. Sudden panic.
And they flew off into the cool mist.